Since last Easter, we as a church family have been learning to live the cross-shaped life from Jesus. The technical term for the cross-shaped life is cruciformity, which means to learning to embody the self-sacrificial love of King Jesus, which God always deserves and honors. It's that idea that God doesn't make things easy for the followers of his son, but he always makes it worth it. Whatever price is paid, he honors that. He rejoices over that. He blesses that. And we see that most clearly in the life of Jesus. Of course, Jesus, from birth to death, was all about humble self-sacrifice, gave himself all the way to death, even death on a cross, and then God raised him from the dead. That's how cruciformity ends. It ends with resurrection, and in Jesus' case, because he was the innocent and righteous Son of God, it ends with exaltation as King of Kings. And so we got to sing my favorite hymn earlier this morning, Crown Him with Many Crowns. Love that. Picturing not just the resurrection, but ascension to the throne at God's right hand as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But that story of Jesus, that downward trajectory of self-denial and self-sacrifice, only to then upon God's judgment and power to be raised from the dead and exalted as kings, that is cruciformity 101 right there. So we're learning from Jesus, but we're also learning from his teachings. He teaches about cruciformity, and one of the simplest places we can see the concept of cruciformity is in the Beatitudes, the 8 cross-shaped attitudes of God's kingdom people, which Jesus used as the introduction in the first sermon in Matthew that we studied almost a year ago now, the Sermon on the Mount. We've been memorizing them this year, and we've read them over and over again together. Can we read them? Not for the last time, because we'll still be in Matthew next week, one more time, but we'll read them for the second to last time, the penultimate time. Does that sound good? Here we go. Jesus came to his disciples and said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." On Good Friday, we talked about how Jesus walked the talk, displaying each of those values, each of those beatitudes on his path to the cross, and even hanging from the cross, putting those on display for us and for God's glory. And on Easter, we celebrate how the second half of those statements, the "for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," on Easter, we celebrate how those promises of blessedness come true for Jesus. Jesus' resurrection validates, authenticates, verifies the very beatitudes we've been memorizing all year. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Yeah, right. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Yeah, right. But what we see in Jesus is proof from God himself that blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those who are persecuted, because the one who is the most poor in spirit and the one who is the most persecuted is now king of the kingdom of heaven. So today we're going to look at the resurrection from a couple different angles. The main angle I want to look at it, though, from today to begin with, is just the angle of the text itself in Matthew 20. We'll actually start the story in Matthew 27, and then we'll continue the story in chapter 28. We're going to look at the historical, not scientific evidence for Jesus' resurrection. I want to first say this. We do not have any scientific evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We don't. By scientific evidence, I mean that is something that can be repeatedly observed and measured through an experiment. So, for example, if you wanted to know the boiling point of water, what would you do? You'd take a pot, fill it with water, put it on the stove, turn the heat all the way up, And then the moment the water started boiling, stick a thermometer in there and take its temp. The moment it starts boiling, write that number down. What's the number? 212 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Now, here's the thing about doing a little science experiment to figure out the boiling point of water. You could do that as long as the conditions remain the same, elevation, atmospheric pressure, all those things, as long as there's no other variable in play. If you're running a true scientific experiment, you could take that measurement today, tomorrow, and in 10,000 years, and you would always get 212 degrees Fahrenheit. It's repeatable and it's measurable. I think that's why a lot of people love science. There's some reliability to it. Like there's some constancy to it. It's why we use it as a tool to figure things out in this world. It's why we're able to shoot a live stream to people all over traveling in the country or at their homes because they're sick or can't make it today. Science. It lets us see the evidence with our own two eyes. It's great. But did you know that's not how history works? In school, you took two classes, right? Science, and then you took history. History happens, I know this is about to get really deep, but history only happens in the past. Did you know that? Think about that for a second. Therefore, it's not reproducible like science. You can't repeat it. You can't see it with your own eyes. You can't measure it. It already happened. We cannot see history directly like we can see and observe a science experiment. And so historians rely on other kinds of evidence, not like a thermometer in a boiling pot of water, but historians, not scientists, rely on a different kind of evidence that science does not. And one of the most important types of evidence that historians use is eyewitness accounts. If you want to know what happened in the lives of Alexander the Great, who lived 300 years before Jesus, or Julius Caesar, who lived 50, 60 years before Jesus, or even George Washington, who lived 1776 years after Jesus, you need to look at what the people who knew them or saw them or were with them or heard about them, you need to look at what they wrote about them. And you know what historians do? When they read eyewitness accounts, they may take them with a grain of salt, and like, okay, where's this guy coming from? Are they biased in some way? What's the deal here? But you know what historians largely do if you want to do history? They trust it. They believe it. That's just what historians do. They trust eyewitness accounts from history to figure out how Alexander the Great died or how Julius Caesar, became the emperor of Rome and how George Washington held the Articles of Confederation states together to bring about a united country and after the Revolutionary War. We rely on eyewitness accounts. And that's the standard we must hold for Jesus and for his resurrection. So we cannot, if you're holding Jesus and his resurrection to a scientific standard where, I want to see it with my own eyes, can't do that. In fact, Jesus told his own disciples, the ones who were privileged to be the first eyewitnesses, he told them, you see because you believe. But blessed are those who believe without seeing. If we take the eyewitness accounts for what they are, and we even can take them with a grain of salt, like, can they be trusted? Were they biased? Did they have anything to gain? Did they have anything to lose? We can even look at them with a critical eye. And the resounding call from the eyewitness accounts is that Jesus rose from the dead. It's history. I don't know what else to say. It's historical fact. Look at the documents. We're going to look at one of those documents today in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew writes a credible eyewitness account that he himself saw the risen Jesus, but he uses in his Gospel eyewitness accounts from other people to put the story together. In fact, Matthew does more than that. Matthew, like a good writer here, tells the account of Jesus' resurrection in kind of a funny way. Even though the story is about a human being who was dead, rising from the dead, coming back to life. Even though the story's about Jesus rising from the dead, Jesus actually gets a very small part in the account he's going to share, the account he writes. In fact, some other figures are going to receive much more screen time, if you will, much more space on the paper. Some figures like the Jewish religious leaders, people like the guards who were posted at the tomb itself. And I want you to pay attention to how Matthew tells the story. Pay attention to how Matthew tells the story. We're going to start number 1. First part of Matthew's story today is in chapter 27, verse 62. And here it is. It's the Jewish leaders' anti-conspiracy measures. The Jewish leaders' anti-conspiracy measures. Yeah, we're going to talk about conspiracy theories today. Does that sound good? Here we go. You guys know you love them. Come on. You know you love them. Verse 62 will start. The next day, so this is the day after Jesus was killed. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. So here the Jewish leaders are again conspiring together. They had been conspiring since early in the book of Matthew to try and figure out a way to put Jesus to death. They wanted to get rid of him. How can we silence this, what they call this man who's a deceiver, they say. And they show up here again, right in the context of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, we live in a world full of conspiracies or claims of conspiracies, so it's not hard to imagine what's going on here in the minds of the Jewish religious leaders. They know that before Jesus had died, he had promised 3 times that he would rise from the dead. And we've seen those, Matthew 16, Matthew 17, and Matthew 20. We've seen him promise that. And so the Jewish leaders are afraid that Jesus' disciples might start a conspiracy. They might steal Jesus' body and claim that he had risen from the dead. Now, in reality, even though they're very pompous and feel high and mighty in trying to prevent this conspiracy from spreading, they're the ones that are the wicked conspirators, not the disciples. Anyways, here's what Pilate says back to them in verse 65. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. The guards would have been these trained, battle-hardened Roman soldiers. They would have stood, probably a group of 4 of them, a squad of 4 was customary, would have stood guard at the tomb. And then a clay or wax seal would have been placed either around the entirety of the stone that had been rolled in front of the tomb, around the entirety of the opening, or maybe just in one part. It didn't matter because the idea was, and then it would have been impressed with a seal, perhaps Caesar's own face, like a ring or an impression would have been made right into the wax or the clay. And here's the idea. Anyone who broke the seal, even if you just moved that stone an inch, anyone who broke the seal, the wax or clay, once it hardened, could be severely punished or even executed. This is like an imperial decree. We're keeping this stone in place. That's the best they knew how. 4 Roman legionnaires and an imperial seal on the tombstone. Now, these certainly would have been enough to ensure that no one could take Jesus' body from the tomb. Jesus' disciples weren't even brave enough to stick with him. When he was still alive and going to the cross, they all fled. Where would they suddenly find the courage to start such a conspiracy now that he's dead, let alone attack these 4 guards, break the seal, run for their lives as fugitives forever? Where would they find the courage for that? So certainly this would be enough to keep him in his place. But then we get to the second part of the story. Number 2, the empty tomb and the risen Christ. The empty tomb and the risen Christ. Chapter 28, verse 1. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. So Jesus died and was buried on a Friday. We honored him and celebrated his work for us on the cross at our Good Friday service just a few days ago. And they did that just before the Sabbath, so that throughout the entirety of the Sabbath day, Jesus was in that tomb. And so the day after the Sabbath, Jesus' female followers would have gone to visit him, to properly mourn his death, which they did not have time to do on that Friday night before it turned into the Sabbath. So at first light, as soon as they can on that Sunday morning, they bravely and faithfully set out to go to the tomb where they saw with their own 2 eyes Jesus buried. Their continued devotion to Jesus, even though he seemed to be defeated, their continued devotion to Jesus here demonstrates just how much they loved him and still did. In this morning's New Testament plan, we read that Jesus had cast 7 demons out of one of the women present here in the story, Mary Magdalene, in Luke 8, verse 2. No wonder she grieved his death so much. Jesus had totally changed her life. 7 demons cast out. He had set her free. No wonder she loved him. But before the women arrived to honor the buried Jesus, something truly amazing happened. Verse 2. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The stones, by the way, that were placed over these tombs, the tombs of the wealthy, were meant to keep scavenging animals out, for one, but also were meant to keep grave robbers out. You don't want people going in and stealing all the stuff that they would put in there in the tomb sometimes, the spices and all those. You don't want people doing that. So these stones would be quite heavy, requiring several men to move. But the angel rolls it back all by himself. Not to let Jesus out, but to reveal to others, standing from the outside, that the tomb was empty. That means that Jesus left the tomb without having the stone rolled away and the seal broken. What's the deal with that? Well, Matthew does not tell us this directly. Matthew doesn't explain it. He just describes what happened. We know that the resurrected Christ in his resurrected body was somehow able to pass through walls. Think about that for a second. The stones in front of the tomb, Jesus got out before it was ever rolled away. Now, Jesus was not a ghost. That would be my first thought. Oh, is he like turned into a ghost or something? But that's not what happened. Because after he rose, we know that people hugged him. Don't hug ghosts. People touched him. People even ate and drank with him. Jesus ate and drank with other people. He had his physical body. But somehow, it did not have the physical limitations that our bodies have. At will, Jesus could pass through walls. Could this be the kind of body that his followers will receive at the final resurrection? Probably. There are several clues in the New Testament that the resurrected bodies of Jesus' followers will be much more like his resurrected body than our present physical bodies. Most importantly, forget the ability to pass through walls. That's all neat. That's cool. But most importantly, our hearts and our minds will be transformed to become like his, for we shall see him as he is. 1 John 3. Now, the angel that was there at that empty tomb, he's not one of those chubby cherubs in a diaper, lounging about on the clouds, strumming a harp. This angel was terrifying. Think video game, terrifying angel from heaven. He descends from heaven, causing an earthquake, moving the stone, and shining like lightning. And the guards rightfully are terrified. In fact, they're not asleep. They pass out or they're frozen. They're paralyzed with fear. But once the women arrive, verse 5, the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." He was so eager to get that off his chest. So verse 8, the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. So the angel here leaves the soldiers to cower in fear, he's like, you guys can just stay over there. But he comforts and reassures the women who followed Jesus as they came to the tomb. He wanted them to not only not be afraid of him, this terrifying angel, but he wants them to be comforted by the glorious fact that their crucified and buried Lord is now alive. He's not in his tomb. And he commissioned them to go and tell the rest of the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee. Where it all started, by the way, most of Matthew takes place in Galilee. That's where Jesus' ministry and his teaching and healing ministry unfolded for over several years. Now, scholars will often point out that if this resurrection story had indeed been fabricated, made up by Jesus' first disciples or by the early church, they would have almost certainly made men the first eyewitnesses of Jesus after his resurrection, not women. Well, why is that? That's because in the ancient world, women held a lower status than they do today. Our culture has worked very hard to elevate the status of women so that they might vote and work and own land. And did you know all that wasn't possible about 150 years ago, even in our own country? They wouldn't have had, in the ancient world, women wouldn't have had much say in public. Their testimony would not have been admissible in court. Therefore, the fact that Jesus chose here, and the angel first and then Jesus, chose to greet these female disciples and make them his first eyewitnesses and to bear that word, that good news first, shows how, well, first of all, how much he cared about them. But secondly, how unlikely it is that any of this story is made up. In fact, as the story is written, it would have been thrown out by the masses unless there was a deeply compelling truth behind it, like Jesus actually rose from the dead. That's what stands behind this story. So the women leave. They go to tell, they're on their way to tell their fellow disciples, but they're still afraid. They're also filled with joy. Can you relate to that? The awesome reality of who God is, his infinite power and wisdom, should strike a kind of fear into our hearts. Not like that horror movie kind of fear, or like the fear of the unknown or something like that, but a kind of fear that immediately puts us into submission. And instead of being left in that fear, though, because we know how gracious he is toward his people, we should also experience a kind of joy from being called to him as one of his children. And so those are the mixed emotions that the women are feeling here now. There's this fear of a God who raises the dead, and they just saw one of his servants, a terrifying angel, and yet they're filled with this joy that their much-loved Jesus has been raised. And Jesus himself would meet them in their joy. Verse 9. Suddenly, Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. And then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." The Greek word translated greetings here is more often translated rejoice or be glad. So this is an extraordinarily happy greeting. This is not just hello. This is be glad. Because the resurrected Jesus changes everything. You see, with their own two eyes, they had seen him die. With their own two eyes, they had seen him buried. And now, with their own two eyes, they see him alive. Eyewitnesses, what would you do if you saw him? What would you do? Well, what did they do? They touched his feet. They worshiped him. This is eyewitness testimony. I mean, this Jesus here was not a hallucination, some sort of vision from God. This is not a ghost. You can't touch hallucinations, visions, or ghosts. This can only be the physically resurrected Jesus Christ. And Jesus himself echoes the angel's command. He says, don't be afraid. Get everyone together in Galilee for what I'll do next. And notice here that Jesus calls his disciples brothers. It's amazing grace. They had all abandoned him in the hour of his greatest need. But Jesus is putting that behind him. Instead, he would reconcile them to himself in Galilee, where it all began, and he would commission them to go and tell the world about him. Besides, Jesus had literally 3 days before paid the price to forgive them of their sins so that he can reconcile with whomever he wants. Amazing grace. He's going to see his brothers. I'm sorry to jolt you away from Jesus. I just want to spend more time with Jesus here in verses 9 and 10, don't you? But Matthew jolts us away. I told you it's weird. He takes us somewhere else all of a sudden. Here's the third part of the story. The conspiracy to cover up Jesus' resurrection. The conspiracy to cover up Jesus' resurrection. Verse 11. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported everything that had happened. You see, these guards had failed in their mission terribly. And they risked being charged with dereliction of duty, which could result in flogging or even death, crucifixion maybe, just what they had done to Jesus. Maybe they would experience if their boss, Pilate, found out what happened. So they don't go back to Pilate. They go back to the Jewish leaders. And they report, quote, everything. I mean, the angel, the empty tomb, the earthquake, they report it all. Man, think about this for a second. This is a wonderful moment for the religious leaders to repent. They knew Jesus had promised his resurrection. It's why they posted the guard in the first place. And now they have eyewitness testimony from the very people they commissioned there that Jesus really did rise from the dead. They had even taunted Jesus on the cross the previous Friday. They had taunted him from the cross saying, if God saves you, we'll believe. But that is sadly not what happens next. Verse 12. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. The religious leaders paid off the soldiers here to spread the very rumor they had tried to prevent in the first place. And the cover-up doesn't even make sense. You know how when the news starts to report these kinds of cover-ups, and you can tell from the first story that comes out, that can't possibly be the case. And then you find out days, months, years later, yep, that wasn't true at all. It was all a joke. It was all a lie. It was all made up. This cover-up doesn't even make sense. Because if the soldiers were sleeping, how did they know who took Jesus' body? How would they know? And regardless, under Roman law, disturbing any tomb, let alone stealing a body, was a crime punishable by death. So if they woke up, say, and caught the disciples in the act, or figured out from clues that it was the disciples, if they knew who did it, why didn't they go and arrest the disciples and press charges? That's Roman law. It doesn't even make sense on the face of it. I find it strange, and I mentioned this earlier, but I find it strange that Matthew almost seems to give more attention as the story unfolds to the religious leaders and the guards than he does to Jesus himself. That's all I want to hear about is more Jesus. Tell me more about what that was like, that resurrection appearance and all of the post-resurrection appearances, and I just want to hear more about that. And actually, the other Gospels will explain quite a bit of those, especially Luke and John. If you want to read more about Jesus' interactions, the time he spent with his disciples after the resurrection, check out those Gospels. They share a lot more than Matthew does. But why does Matthew tell the story this way? Why does Matthew kind of make these other figures almost more prominent, even though Jesus is the one being raised from the dead? Well, here's the deal. Nothing is more important for Matthew here in this account than to uncover the cover-up. Because in the time of his writing, and even frankly to this day in 2024, where all these conspiracy theories about Jesus can float around and people throw out all different kinds of other explanations, even though there's zero evidence for any of it, the only evidence that exists point to a resurrected Lord. Matthew's goal here is to uncover the cover-up, and nothing is more important than that. Nothing is more important to Matthew than to make sure that his original readers, who were mostly Jewish Christians or Jews he was trying to reach, but even we have the incredible privilege of reading his gospel today. It's been passed down to us through the millennia. His goal is to make sure that us readers have every reason to believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead, physically, literally. Because the resurrection of Jesus Christ is not just the happy ending of a tragic fairy tale. It's not just a feel-good story for your difficult moments in life. It's not just wishful thinking. It is a historical event and the hope of humanity. Let's talk about the implications of Jesus' resurrection. So what if he did rise? So what if he didn't? Why does it matter right now for me in Fruitport, Michigan, on March 31st, 2024, whether or not Jesus rose from the dead? I want to very quickly urge you to consider the implications of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. What if Jesus didn't rise? If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, Jesus was a delusional liar. If Jesus felt weird typing that earlier this week, but that's the implication. If Jesus predicted his resurrection and yet it never happened, that would make him a worthless fraud who died for a worthless cause. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, those who said they saw Jesus alive are liars. The eyewitnesses were either hallucinating, they were mentally unwell, they were terribly mistaken, or outright being deceptive. Of course, there were hundreds of them, so they were all one, they would all have to be one or the other. If Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, it undermines, frankly, everything written in Scripture, and none of it can be trusted. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we're still hopelessly lost to sin and to death. This world is beyond repair, broken by sin, and in the end, everyone just dies, and that's it. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, you'd be a fool to live a cross-shaped life. You'd be a fool to live a cross-shaped life. In 1 Corinthians 15:19, Paul says that if Christ wasn't raised, we are of all people most to be pitied. Why is that? Because it will have all been a waste. Christians would have lived their whole lives in self-denial and self-sacrifice in hope of something better, only to find that there was nothing better. What fools we would be. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, stop learning from Jesus and spreading this lie. Just stop it. The billions who follow Jesus today, including us, should reject Jesus, close the churches, and try to find maybe the next most important thing in this meaningless life to devote ourselves to. Maybe education, politics, career, money, fun, hobbies. I don't know. It'd just be football for me. I don't know. Just football, a lot of football, way more than currently. If Jesus didn't rise, what we must not do is continue spreading that lie. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, Jesus is the King of the universe. Jesus' resurrection is God's gigantic stamp of approval on the person and work of Jesus Christ. Everything he did, everything he taught must be seen as right and good, and he rightly deserves all of our worship, allegiance, and obedience. If Jesus did rise from the dead, the biblical authors wrote the true word of God. The resurrection becomes this authenticating building block, a foundation by which the rest of the book can be trusted. Even the parts that are hard to believe, you can believe them now. They can be true if Jesus rose. Because if God can raise the crucified Jesus back to life, he can do anything he wants to do. Even the parts of the Bible we don't like the parts that confront our sin and our evil opinions and attitudes and behaviors, those parts must be heeded. Because the one who raised Jesus has all power and authority, and he's given him to his Son. If Jesus did rise from the dead, our sin can be forgiven and death will be defeated. Jesus' resurrection proves that what Jesus accomplished on the cross is legit. He said he would give his life as a ransom for sinners, and that's exactly what he did. He secured forgiveness from sin for all who believe and ensured that they too will share in his victory over death. If Jesus did rise from the dead, you'd be a fool to live anything other than the cross-shaped life. Jesus' resurrection reveals that God truly does bless the cross-shaped life. Self-denial and self-sacrifice and enduring suffering and resisting temptation and caring for others are exactly what God deserves and honors. There are much easier ways to live than the cross-shaped life, than following Jesus, than being a disciple. But none of them are worth it. Only following the crucified and risen King. And then lastly, if Jesus did rise from the dead, nothing matters more than learning from Jesus and spreading this good news. There is nothing more important or urgent than submitting ourselves as disciples of Jesus and helping others to do the same. So I want to end with just a couple questions. What do you believe about the crucified and risen King Jesus? What do you believe? What did he die for? Did he rise? And who is he to you right now? A dead man, the subject of a myth? Or the resurrected King of all things, including our hearts and our wills and our minds? And how will that belief then transform your life? Do you actually believe that Jesus rose from the dead or not? Now, you still may have questions, man. I had all sorts of questions. Doubts. I needed other kinds of proof and ways of thinking about it. And that's okay as long as you're seeking the answers. I'd love to help you find them. Again, please reach out through calvarymesquite.com. Use the cards to drop them off at the desk in the lobby. Connect with one of us after the service, or a brother or sister in Christ, a fellow or a Christian that you're wrestling with these truths. Somebody you trust, somebody you know, talk to them if you'd be more comfortable talking to them. And I'll say this, it's okay to not be sure right now, but it's not okay to stay that way. Figure this out. You've got to answer this question. And you've got to answer it in the affirmative. I believe Jesus rose from the dead. Because we never know when we might die and be held to account for sin that could have been forgiven by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And every moment of our lives is a gift to live for God's glory and others good. There's literally no time to waste. So come to terms with the fact that Jesus rose from the dead and ask whatever question, talk to whoever you need to get to that point. See, here's bottom line. God is good. God is great, infinitely good and infinitely great. He proved that in history, through the historical crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He proved it. And nothing and no one can erase history. It already happened. Can't erase it. You could try to ignore it. You can try to resist it. But you cannot undo it. It's been done. He's done it for us. And we, as a church family, we stake our hope and our lives on that.